Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University. Today we are taking a look at how Pokemon might be as pets, specifically one Pokemon that might actually be kind of reasonable for a change, Growlithe. If you have a suggestion on a Pokemon as a pet to cover in the future, make sure to let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, you might as well click the subscribe and thumbs up buttons. It really helps out the channel a lot, and you can get notified when we put out another video like this. As with every video in the series, please go check out the YouTube channel Clint's Reptiles. That's where I get sort of the format and the idea for this entire series from. He makes educational content about reptiles, amphibians, invertebrates. He even, for Mother's Day one year, he did like a pet rating video about his own children, which I think was honestly one of my favorite all-time YouTube videos. So please, it really means a lot to me if you go check out his channel as a personal favor to me. So with that, we are here today to answer one question, and that is Growlithe the best pet Pokemon for you? Growlithe gets a score of 4.2 out of 5, our highest score ever, while Arcanine gets a score of 2.4 out of 5. And that comes down to our 5 categories, which are handleability, care, hardiness, availability, and upfront costs. So I specify that Growlithe and Arcanine get separate scores because unlike, the Pokemon that we've covered so far in this series that can evolve, being the Blastoise line, Feraligatr line, and Charizard line, Growlithe, you have the option to not evolve. Which obviously is because to evolve Growlithe, you use an item, the Firestone, as opposed to those other 3 Pokemon used as an example that evolve via level up. With those other Pokemon, we've sort of treated evolution as an unavoidable thing that is roughly equivalent to aging and, growing up and maturing in the real world. I still fully stand by that stance, even though some people in the comments have sort of argued that you can just, push B, to stop your Charmander from evolving, this cute little Charmander from evolving into this, the death machine that is Charizard. However, I sort of personally almost see that as like a form of like pet abuse. For example, if you have a pet alligator, the real world animal, Alligator mississippiensis, if you have one as a pet, technically, you could keep it from growing to the, 10, 12 plus foot animal that it, naturally would be if you just keep it in a significantly smaller enclosure, around 4 or 5 feet, and feed it poorly. It will not grow to its full size. Even though that 4-foot alligator is way easier to keep as a pet than, like I said, the 10 plus foot long animal that should eventually be, most people would agree that like doing that is abusing that animal, and you should not have a pet if you plan on doing that kind of thing to it to make it easier for you to keep. I feel like that's not a controversial thing. I feel like most people would agree on that. This is sort of analogous to the way I sort of see like preventing your Pokemon from evolving, at least like in the pet sense. The games do allow you to do it, and I understand that, but we're sort of keeping game mechanics a little bit out of it and only focusing on game lore things, However, because like I said, Growlithe evolves via an item, the Firestone, it has like a natural way to not evolve by just denying it being exposed to a Firestone. And because of that, you can basically choose whether you want to end up with an Arcanine or if you want to just keep it as a Growlithe. So they get different scores. Alright, so let's break down their scores now. So for handleability, Growlithe gets a score of 4 out of 5, while Arcanine gets a score of 2 out of 5. Growlithe is basically just a medium-sized dog. It's a little taller than a Border Collie while being about the same weight. And don't get me wrong, dogs can be potentially really, really dangerous. I'm pretty sure like dog attacks are the most common animal attacks like worldwide, or at least in the United States, the statistics that I'm familiar with. So obviously they can be dangerous, but everything about Growlithe, its Pokedex entries, honestly, you would not even be able to tell that Growlithe is a fire type by reading its Pokedex entries. It just says how it's a very loyal, very friendly, trusting Pokemon. So it seems pretty much like a regular dog to me. Those same Pokedex entries do say that while it's very friendly and loving toward its trainer, pretty much anybody else that comes near it, it barks at and tries to bite. And so I'm sure that, as with any like real world dog, that could be kind of worked out with like obedience training. I'm sure that must be some kind of a thing in the Pokemon world, I would imagine. So I'm sure you could get that worked out. Arcanine gets a lower score pretty much just because of its size. You know, the largest dog breeds get somewhere between 3 and 4 feet tall total. Arcanine is over 6 feet tall. That, you know, it's taller than I am. And just because of that, it would be, you know, much more like I was saying with, you know, Blastoise, Feraligatr, and Charizard. It's much more to be playing with you than you are with it. It also weighs about 350 pounds, which does sound like a lot, but for an animal its size really isn't all that heavy. Like most Pokemon, it's considerably lighter than it should be for its size. So that might make it less dangerous, but still, it's a 350-pound animal trying potentially to play with you. Not my idea of fun. Unlike Growlithe, though, none of Arcanine's Pokedex entries mention anything about its temperament. So we're just going to assume that it's roughly the same kind of temperament as a Growlithe. So I would really recommend that if you are going to evolve your Growlithe, that you get those temperament things worked out, such as, you know, it being friendly to you but trying to bite anyone else, because if an Arcanine bites you, it very well could kill you. So I'd recommend getting that worked out before you evolve it, and since you can choose when to evolve it, that's not really a problem. Like I mentioned, they are fire types, although unlike Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard, they don't have an exposed flame on them, which makes them significantly safer. Although that is always a risk with them as well, is that they could accidentally burn you. Although, like I said, because the Pokedex doesn't mention anything about it, you know, having any kind of fire abilities, I would imagine that that's not that big of a concern. Next we have Care, for which Growlithe gets a score of 3 out of 5, and Arcanine gets a score of 1 out of 5. Unlike all of the previous Pokemon that we've covered, Growlithe seems just like a Pokemon you can just kind of let wander about your house like a regular dog. And, you know, like I said, everything that I've seen just sort of makes it seem like it's a regular dog. So I would imagine that you just sort of care for it the same as you would for a medium-sized dog. It would probably need to be, you know, walked, you know, or exercised in like a big yard or something probably every day. And it's pretty light for a dog. Its size, so it's probably pretty athletic, so it would probably need a lot of space to be able to run and do dog things. You know, it's not like it's a pug or, you know, like a bulldog or something that can only walk 3 feet and then it falls over because it can't breathe. No, Growlithe would probably be a pretty athletic, you know, highly active dog. So because dogs aren't terribly hard to care for, obviously if they were, they wouldn't be nearly as popular as pets as they are, but they are still a handful, so Growlithe gets like a medium score for care. Arcanine, on the other hand, is much more like keeping a meat-eating horse than it is a dog, because the amount of space you would need for an Arcanine is just unreal. Supposedly, according to the Pokedex, so big grain of salt, it can run 6,200 miles in a 24-hour period. That works out to roughly 250 miles per hour. And keep in mind that's a sustained speed and not a sprint. You know, I would imagine that Arcanine could sprint probably much faster than that. Obviously, sort of following the same logic that I use for Growlithe, because it's pretty light for its size, it's probably rather athletic and would need a large amount of space to be able to run, you know. So that's much bigger than like your average yard. You'd probably need a couple of acres, realistically, for Arcanine to be able to roam over. Also, unlike Growlithe, you wouldn't be able to keep it in your house just because it's way too big. You know, I doubt it would fit. It'd probably barely fit through this door frame that I have going into my bedroom here. So, not to mention it trying to like lay on your couch with you. Again, a 350-pound dog chilling on the couch with me, probably not ideal. Although that's, again, more toward handleability. But you would need a space for it outside, and probably a shelter, a big old doghouse for it outside, which is much more closer to the size of, like, a shed or potentially like a barn instead of, you know, a dog house that's like only comes up to here. Both Growlithe and Arcanine would probably need just regular dog food, I would think. Maybe more meat than, you know, commercially available dog food. Although, as we've talked about, food in the Pokemon world is weird. It just seems like all Pokemon can eat the same commercially available Pokemon food, so I don't really know. But as I mentioned with the Charizard line, because they produce fire and, you know, run at probably a higher temperature than a non-fire type Pokemon with similar biology otherwise, because it needs to run hotter and potentially make that fire, it would need more calories, so it probably just need a substantially large amount of food. Next we have hardiness, for which Growlithe gets a score of 5 out of 5, and Arcanine gets a score of 3 out of 5. Like I've mentioned several times already, Growlithe's basically just a dog. Dogs, especially medium-sized dogs, tend to be pretty healthy. Obviously that varies from like breed to breed, but they tend to be pretty hardy generally. Especially like the little dogs tend to have health problems, and big dogs tend to have some health problems, but the medium-sized dogs tend to be pretty hardy. So I don't see many, you know, particular, you know, that come straight to mind medical problems that Growlithe might have. But that's not true when we get to Arcanine. And Arcanine gets a lower score because, sort of like I mentioned, a lot of the bigger dog breeds have, you know, pretty considerable health problems. And this is due to a variety of reasons, mostly the way we've bred them over, you know, the thousands of years that we've been keeping dogs. And most of those health problems tend to be because of their size or their weight, you know, joint problems, things like that. But these probably wouldn't really apply to Arcanine for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's not a selectively bred animal. You know, it naturally evolved to be the way that it is. So if it was, you know, dying prematurely because its joints were bad, it probably, that, you know, adaptation would be selected against, and that would be filtered out of the population. So I just don't think it would have those problems because humans haven't been fiddling with its genetics for a few thousand years. B, like I've said, it's considerably lighter than it should be for an animal its size, so it doesn't have all the weight on its joints that it probably should for an animal as big as it is. So Arcanine's roughly the size of a horse, but it only weighs like 350 pounds compared to a horse which regularly weigh over like 1,000 pounds. Although this does sort of change with some of the things introduced in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Because you have size variations introduced in those games, Arcanine can be up to about 580 pounds and as tall as like 8 3/4 feet, so almost 9 feet tall and close to 600 pounds, which again is considerably light for, you know, a 9 foot tall quadrupedal animal. 580 pounds is so incredibly light. I would expect that animal to easily weigh close to 2,000 pounds, but Pokemon. Either way, no matter what, it's still really light for its size and probably wouldn't have those same health problems, but because it might, it gets a somewhat lower score than Growlithe does. Next, for availability, Growlithe gets a score of 5 out of 5, and Arcanine gets a score of 4 out of 5. Growlithe would likely be like a super popular pet in the Pokemon world for all the same reasons that dogs are here in the real world. You know, it would be small, it's a manageable size, it's easy to care for, it's not too dangerous, and it's fun and friendly to play with. For all those reasons, you know, that's why dogs are popular, so it makes sense that Growlithe would also be pretty popular. Because of this, I am positive that you could find a Growlithe breeder in the Pokemon world to buy a Growlithe from, or if you don't want to spend the money to buy one from a breeder, you absolutely could go catch one from the wild in pretty much every region. The exceptions are Hoenn, where it's only found as a hidden Pokemon on Mount Pyre in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Sinnoh, where you can only find it on one specific route with Fire Red inserted into the DS Lite. So you have to be playing it in a DS Lite and have a copy of Fire Red to be inserted in the GBA slot. And Kalos, where you can find it in the Friend Safari. Also, as a side note, I have yet to come up with like a realistic sounding way to explain these kind of weird encounter mechanics in some games. to make it seem like a good in-world, you know, explanation for it. So if you can think of one, please let me know that down below. So yeah, Growlithe is pretty widely available, and because of that, Arcanine would be too. You can find wild Arcanine in Kanto and Galar. If you wanted to go that route, I really wouldn't recommend it, just because of those behavior things that I mentioned earlier. You would want to get it worked out where, yeah, it'll be friendly to you, but like, say you have, you know, someone that you live with, whether it's your parents, significant other, children, it'll be friendly to you, but it will not be friendly to anyone else. And I would not want a carnivorous horse to be angry at me. I don't know about you. The only reason that Arcanine gets a 4 out of a 5, like Growlithe does, is because in some regions it can be kind of hard to track down a Firestone. Not all of them. Most regions you can just buy them at like select markets, so you might have to travel around your region to go get the Firestone. But most regions you can actually find them just kind of out and about in the world. So because of that, it gets docked just a little bit. And for our last category, we have upfront cost, for which Growlithe gets a score of 4 out of 5, and Arcanine gets a score of 2 out of 5. Compared to real-world dogs, breeding Growlithes would be so incredibly easy, and because of that, because of how popular they are, I would imagine that you could literally just like shop around to find a Growlithe that would be relatively cheap, because, you know, you don't have, they just hatch from eggs. How convenient is that, you know? So you wouldn't really have to deal with all of the breeder things that you go through with going through like a dog breeder here in the real world. So because of that, Growlithe would be like real cheap. You don't need like a fancy enclosure or tank or cage for your Growlithe like you do for the other Pokemon that we've talked about thus far. So that dramatically cuts down on the cost. You would need a large amount of food like on hand before you brought it home, which sometimes is and sometimes is not factored into upfront costs, depending on like how long the Pokemon could probably go without food. Most reptiles can probably go a solid amount of time without food. You can't do that with a mammal-like Pokemon. So that food, and quite a bit of it, as I mentioned, would need to be on hand when you bring your Growlithe home. Arcanine, on the other hand, gets real expensive because while you don't need like an enclosure for it, you do need a big yard. And I have not tried to buy land myself, but from what I hear, it can be pretty expensive. You would need several acres for it to, you know, run around and exercise, and I have no idea what the real estate market is like in the Pokemon world, so I just have to sort of assume that it's similar to the real world. And like I said, from what I hear, buying land, especially a couple acres, could be pretty pricey depending on where it is. And you would definitely want that land up front before you evolve it into, you know, you could not have the land while you have a Growlithe, but I consider it an upfront cost because you need it before you get it to an Arcanine. Plus you'd want like your doghouse, shed, barn thing there as well. That's an upfront cost, so yeah, Arcanine's pretty expensive. And that is why Growlithe gets a score of 4.2, which then decreases to a 2.4 when you evolve it to an Arcanine. You know, there's a reason why dogs are so popular here in the real world, but I would imagine that they would be much less popular if they were horse-sized. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science, as well as if you feel like our content is worthy of supporting in this way, we do have a Patreon, the link to which will be down in the description. A massive shout out to our patrons over on Patreon, Patty Murphy and Sam Accardi. Your support means more than you could ever, literally ever possibly know. And lastly, thank you so much for watching, and as always, there's a time and place for everything.